position very often by trimming wages somewhere up the ladder. So it's part and parcel of what we do is an attempt to try and equalise pay or make it more equal. I mean, I would argue, we talked about the social impact of that, the economic importance of ensuring that more, if you like, baseline jobs are better skilled and better paid, and frankly, better recognised within the workplace, is absolutely fundamental. And equality matters. But
David, what I want you to confront directly what Phil Hanlon said at the beginning of this part of the conversation. Would you challenge this idea and argue that actually wealth creation and making everyone's society is better off is a greater good if it produces more wealth than perhaps limiting the amount of wealth you can produce, making people more equal?
I'm slightly split in because I don't think that, and I must admit, we have some severe inequalities in certain, probably FTSE companies. If you actually scratch below the surface in Scotland, some of the assertions about high earners in Scotland are way out of line. The numbers are extremely small. For example, there are 12,000 people in Scotland on the higher rate, the 45p tax rate. So even if we tax to squeeze them till they all emigrate, if you like, we're still not going to make a lot of money out of them even if they all stay. So we're not talking about massive amounts of money that group of people have. And the thing I would always challenge as well is, why are government taxing people that earn the minimum wage? They're always pushing employers to raise the minimum wage, but yet the government taxes them. So there's a bit roundabout there. But where I also don't think employers, I would say that some I'm not sure understand enough, but I do think that bigger employers certainly understand that having a healthy and happy and content workforce is actually economically productive, and it makes their business a success. So I don't see that as massive.
All right, well let's give Phil Hanlon the last word on this, because what you're arguing is not entirely obvious. I mean, if you have two individuals and their incomes are both rising, and they're quite happy with that. If I'm the person who's got less of an income, it's not entirely clear to me why I should be any healthier just because the other person's getting even richer than I am.
And if you look at it at an individual level, that logic is absolutely correct. I have no argument with that. But if you look at it at a whole societal level, and you take two hypothetical countries, in country A, there's competition, dog eat dog, massive distribution of wealth, opportunity, and no sense of cohesion. Same amount of money. This same amount of money, but social cohesion, sense of wanting to solve the problems of deindustrialisation, all in it together, across the generational support. That equally wealthy country has better health and social outcomes. All the international data suggests that to be true. Now, what you do with that insight isn't straightforward. You get back to these individual debates about the workplace and about each part of the workforce wanting the best for themselves and so on. So it doesn't solve the problem, but it's a fundamental insight that if you want a country that is already wealthy to do better, you need to take the whole population along with you. And in Scotland in particular, if we talk about inequality, I don't think it is about the highest paid and the bankers and so on. I think it is what we do with about a fifth of the population who haven't yet recovered from the deindustrialisation. When those high-skilled, good jobs, male breadwinner model society disappeared, it's never going to come back. And there are people, individuals, who have found their way out of that, but there are many communities that have yet to have a route out of that reaction to deindustrialisation. And a future Scotland could confront that. The fact that we don't have solutions at the moment doesn't mean that we couldn't yet have them.
Right, okay. Look, I want to move on. Older people and people who are becoming old, Pauline Banks, your special subject. This is such a complex area. I want to ask you something very basic. If you're either an elderly person or you're someone who's approaching retirement age, and you see all these arguments about the referendum campaign, there's almost a problem. It's just not. It's not a question of what side you're on, isn't it? It's almost so complicated. You don't even know how to think about this stuff.
I think people know very well how to think about it. I mean, we're talking about people approaching retirement age. You're talking about people from their 60s up to 100s. So you're talking actual 2 or 3 generations there. So you can't just put everybody who's older into the one category. I think there are significant things. People are very concerned about their pensions, whether their pensions are going to change. We have been assured that they will not change. There are issues about the pension age rising when we have poorer health in Scotland. white paper has suggested that they will put the pension age up to 66, the same as England, but they will then look at it again before they put it up to 67 or 68 on the basis of what's appropriate for Scotland. Because while we do have more older people in Scotland than there are in England, they don't live as long. So it's actually a hugely complex picture to be looking at.
And what do you reckon, on your view, it sort of all evens out?
I couldn't tell you, I'm not the economist.
Well, what do you make of this, David Watts? This.
Well, I think it was very interesting from from a business perspective. There's a real worry about the future. Well, somebody who's not far away from going off on a pension, if you like, I would be quite interested to know who's going to pay for my pension. So where is the next workforce going to come from? And that's a real challenge with the demographic.
But just on a specific issue, I'm just curious whether your members. There is this issue, isn't there, about cross-border pensions and whether there might be European rules which would mean that, say, if an English company, which was, if you were working for one but working in Scotland, that they would have to be fully funded. Just explain that. Is that an issue for?
It absolutely is an issue. I think there's the personal issue, and then there's the structural issue, and there's obviously the state pension, and then there's the private pension. The private pension industry, absolutely, the EU rules are being put in place. Basically, you have to be residing in the country where the majority of your business is done, and hence the reason Standard Life have taken what they see as precautionary steps that they may have to follow. They've done a risk assessment. They've assessed that most of their business in that sector is south of the border, and they have to set up company structures there, which they may or may not inhabit, depending on depending on the vote, and then the settlement after the vote as well, and whether in fact the EU will move from that at all. So absolutely, there's some, and I've got to say that's one. There's no question whatsoever. So pick an industry that's most concerned because of the regulatory nature and the potential costs, and there's no question the financial services industry is seriously concerned about independence, and it has the right to be, if you say, because of these two factors: the actual potential business costs, which we'd end up paying for, and the regulatory costs.
Kirsten, what do you think, if you're an elderly person, you should be thinking about when you think about the referendum?
I would be less concerned about pensions and very, very much concerned about care and long-term care and nursing care and what was going to happen to my money and my benefits and my assets. And I think what is interesting is that we have in Scotland a very complex system of welfare with certain areas like benefits and welfare benefits and pensions decided in Westminster, and other areas like social care decided on a very local area basis. And in fact, not just Scotland, but local authorities controlling that system. And what we see is an awful lot of waste in the system and an awful lot of unfairness in the system. We have 32 different local authorities in Scotland, and that means 32 different systems of local care, of social care and entitlements to care, etc.
But I mean, again, in the referendum debate,
yes.
Have you not put your finger on? I mean, what you've just said there, I've not heard addressed by either side.
And I find it utterly shocking, actually, as somebody who's well, you'll know from my accent, I'm the only non-Scot sitting around here. But I'm a Scot by adoption, and I have a stake in this. My family has a stake in this in the future as well. And neither side is grasping the nettle here. We have a crisis in the funding of long-term and delivery of long-term care for elderly people in the whole of the developed world. We need to really do something quite serious about this. Now, we would have, to link it back to the referendum, we could have a very interesting debate about the linking of welfare benefits and social care and, for example, putting together packages of attendance allowance and personal independence payments that would enable people to actually plan for their future, plan for their care. We could look at having a system of long-term care insurance that is devolved to Scotland, such as Germany has. But neither side is raising
sorry, just to be clear, this is where individuals would actually pay into the insurance scheme.
Where
and in return for which, for example, if you are lucky enough to own a house, your house wouldn't be taken away. If
exactly.
You needed the care.
Rather than it being an asset-based thing on your house, it's a contribution from employers and from individuals and from the state. It's a three-way kind of relationship. Now, Scotland could do that, but it could only really do that with independence because it's got to control the taxation system and the economic policy as well as the social care system. It's interesting that, and I go back to Dave's point saying that, the white paper had some interesting ideas about what it thought some of the problems were, but it didn't really present us with any exciting or innovative or groundbreaking solutions.
I wonder if we could take a step back here, because I think we're in danger of saying that some of these shortcomings, shall we say, of the political debate began and will end with the referendum debate. These are shortcomings with our political debate and our politics in this country. You know, and we have not...
But presumably across the UK.
Well, yes, across the UK, but I do think it manifests itself in a particular way here in Scotland. I mean, it's not exactly a secret that I'm probably the ex-politician on the panel here. And I would say that for the 14 years since we had, or 15 years since we had devolution, you know, if you monitor, as some of us have been sad enough to do, both from a distance and from within, if you monitor, for example, the kind of debates that we've had about health or education, say, right? Forget about the constitutional question and further powers for a minute. We have not had fundamental searching discussions that have, in any meaningful sense, cut across party lines about how we create a sustainable, flourishing NHS, or how we tackle some of the real issues going on in our education system.
Hang on, I'm not going to fling your political past at you too much. But,
You're allowed to, others do.
But Labour were at least as complicit as anyone else
I agree.
in not having a debate about public service reform in Scotland.
I agree.
In a way that even if you don't like the Blairites, they did have in England.
And I agree, and this is something I've been on record for a number of years in saying, and indeed was a factor in my decision to stand down from elected office. Because, and this is my point, that it is our wider political debate and the way our parties organise and the way that they compete for votes that is a fundamental problem here. It is writ large now in the hothouse that is the referendum debate. But unless and until we see some fundamental shifts in the way we discuss these issues, and frankly the only way forward I can see is having an awful lot more voices, and I don't mean just so-called, and I think many of us eschew this label, but not just so-called expert voices, but many more wider voices who are prepared to enter into that space, then, you know, I think we've got a problem, because we're not asking the hard questions, and the political parties have not been asking some of these questions for a long, long time.
But if you look at the governance system in Scotland since devolution, it has engaged with the civic population in a far more constructive way, with the trade unions, with different interest groups, with, for example, issues around domestic violence, with women's groups, much more effectively than the Westminster government has.
Absolutely,
so the argument that would follow
isn't
from
what
that
delivers change.
But the argument that would follow from that, if I can just finish, is that if you gave Scotland more powers to do that, it would do it much more effectively and much more in Scotland's interests than the Westminster government.
Well, we've broadened this out to the way I wanted to broaden it out, which is really to ask the question, all these issues we've discussed tonight, is the referendum debate irrelevant to them? And even if it is relevant to them, Phil Hanlon, addressing them? I mean, you know, the point Susan Deacon's making is that there are all sorts of issues to do with public sector reform, for example, which simply are not talked about in Scotland.
It's not addressing them, but it is relevant to them. It clearly is. And it's another example, this debate, about how we really are all in it together. So the average Scot will have 19 years of chronic illness before death. So it doesn't really matter when you die.
Thanks for cheering us up. We're getting to the end of this programme. You could have said something nice.
But you see, you'll be fine, yeah. But what that suggests is that we need a public debate, a political debate, a societal debate about how we shorten that. Scotland performs badly against the rest of Europe on that length of time and on our life expectancy. Our life expectancies will probably continue to rise, but the crucial issue is how well we are, particularly in those older ages. Okay. And that will be dependent on early years and that working life and everything we've been talking about. So the referendum debate is absolutely relevant to all of that. But it hasn't
not necessarily
really
what's actually being debated.
Exactly so.
Right. Joe Armstrong, what do you make of that? I mean,
I agree. I think the referendum has started to force people to think about things slightly differently, and the issue about public sector reform is going to have to come in, and it's alluded to within, you know, the one of the current government's public sector reform bill that they're introducing. But for me, the issue isn't about all these policy ideas, which some of them are really good, but it's about where we are now and where we think we're going to get to, because we can't currently afford what we've currently got, and how we're going to afford them has to be factored into that debate. Because if you can't tax the super rich and we haven't got the capacity to grow the economy as fast as we might like, then in order to deliver them, we've either got to do